Well, this morning, if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Daniel chapter 1. And we'll look at the entire chapter, verse 1 through 21. And the series here, as we're going through Daniel, I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn. So I want to entitle this series, Lessons from Daniel. And today we're going to have a lesson. It'll be a particular kind of a lesson today. And I think we can learn a lot. I've enjoyed, over the last couple of weeks, really just digging into this and reading it over and over and just seeing how much really is here. And truth be known, actually I could preach a message just on verses 1 and 2. But if we did that, it would take us several years to get through Daniel. And what we're going to do, we're going to try to take it a chapter at a time or whatever segment God gives me at a time. But I think today, if we look at the first 21st verses, I think there are 4 things we can actually see in this chapter and learn from him. So beginning in verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave," notice this, "the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, into the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of all his officials, to bring some of the sons of Israel, including those that were of the royal family and nobles, youths whom seemed to have no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, who had the ability to be serving in the king's court. And he'd ordered them to teach them literature and language of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. The king appointed them a daily portion of the king's food, his choice food, and the wine which he drank. And he appointed that they should be educated for 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years they should come back before the king and serve personally in his service. Now among them were the sons of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned them new names to them. Daniel he assigned the name Belshazzar, Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission, or he requested from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed you to have the food and the drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggardly than the youths of your same age? Then would you make me forfeit my head to the king?" But Daniel said to the overseer and to the commander whom the officials he had over the officials, and who had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given just vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let us come before your appearance and let you observe us in the presence with the other youths who have been eating the king's choice food and drinking his wine, and then you do with your servants as you see fit." So he listened to them, and in this matter he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter in just 10 days. It'll go show you the king's food just isn't always the best, right? They seemed better, and they were fatter than all the other youths who'd been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued with their choice and kept the choice food and kept the wine from them and continued feeding them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intellect in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams, so that at the end of days, or at the end of those 3 years, which the king had specified to present them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered into the king's personal service, as was for the matter of wisdom and understanding, which the king consulted with them. He found them 10 times more better, or 10 times more intelligent than all the magicians and all the conjurers who was in his realm. And Daniel continued there until the 1st year of the reign of Cyrus the king. Daniel, a book of prophecy, but also Daniel is a book of practicality. This is a historical book, and Daniel writes from a historical perspective. But the whole focus is on prophecy and seeing and God revealing to him what is going to take place in the future. I remember back in 1988, Edgar C. Whisenhunt, former NASA engineer and Bible student, he predicted the rapture was going to come between September the 11th and September the 13th. He even published a book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Take Place in 88. I remember when I got to Florida Baptist in 89, there was this book. It was in the library, and all the students had been reading it, looking for how did this guy make these calculations. Of course, he was a mathematician, so he had thought, well, these first 2,000 years this happened, the next 2,000 this happened, and so somewhere right in here is where the next great event is going to happen. Well, the next great event is going to be the rapture, and so he wrote this book, 88 Reasons. Another guy wrote a book called 89 Reasons God Didn't Come Back in 89 or 88, but so that would make him a false prophet. Now, there's been a lot of false prophets, in fact. There was a Chinese man by the name of Reverend Hang Young Man Ho. He predicted the end of the world October 28th, 1992. Of course, the end of the world hasn't come yet. We talk about Nostradamus. People make all this great ado over Nostradamus and all of his predictions that have come true. Great. Let's look at all the ones that haven't come true. Here's what it boils down to. According to God's word, a prophet is a true prophet when he's right, not 90% of the time, not 70% of the time. He's right 100% of the time, because if he's a true prophet, he's a prophet of God. Everybody else might be good guessers, but Daniel is one of these that you can tell everything Daniel has predicted has already come to pass or is coming to pass. And so what we see here is Daniel is a true prophet. He is appointed by God. There's always been those in the future that are looking to predict the future. And that's really what they're doing. They're looking at different signs and things, and they're predicting things. But what Daniel is doing, Daniel is showing us, and will show us over these next few days, these few weeks, what God is saying and what God is doing and how it's relevant to us. So Daniel's not a false prophet. He's a true God-appointed prophet. In fact, even though his book is the shortest of all the major prophets, the major prophets have big books, Daniel is a major prophet. He has the smallest book. However, it is referred to more in the New Testament than any other Old Testament book. It also contains more prophecies that have already been fulfilled than any other book. Daniel is a prophet from the exile, which is a unique perspective for him to share with us from. He literally writes from the heart of Babylon in captivity. I want to remind you that 100 years earlier, the northern kingdom of Israel had been conquered by the Syrians. And so you would have thought, and by the way, the reason that they're being captured anyway and taken into captivity is because of their rebellion. They were not worshiping God the way God had outlined for them to worship him. They were forsaking even the rotation of the fields. He said, you're to farm for 6 years, and in the seventh year you let that land lay dormant, and you don't do anything to that land. And they were not even observing that. They're observing nothing. They were in rebellion. Idols had been brought in because they had brought these women in from Egypt and everywhere else, and they brought their idols with them. So now you have Israel out there, and Judah also, worshiping false gods, and God says, okay, enough's enough. So back in 722, Assyria takes over and brings Israel into captivity. You would have thought Judah would say, whoa, time out, wait a minute. Something's going on here. But they didn't. They kept living their life just the way Israel had, and now God says, okay, it's time. And so what we have here is we have Nebuchadnezzar coming in and taking over. And so we would have thought they would have learned. One of the key points to remember in this book over these next several weeks, this is a history book. It is a prophetic book, but it is a practical book that you and I can learn today how to live our lives closer and more in line like Daniel did. The book of Daniel was written by Daniel himself. In fact, there are times he refers to himself in the third person, but Jesus himself referred in Matthew 24:15 to Daniel being the author, and Daniel's contemporary Ezekiel refers to him being the author. So the theme of Daniel is clearly the sovereignty of God. And Daniel makes one thing very clear. There are no heroes in the Bible except God. He's very emphatic about it. Daniel is not a hero. We look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the names that were changed in the fiery furnace. We look at Daniel and the lion's den, and we'll go through all those things. Wow, what a hero we can learn from Daniel. I'm not a hero. They're not a hero. There's one hero. It's him. And so God is sovereign. And so Daniel wants to make that point clear. So the theme of Daniel focuses on the sovereignty of God. Daniel, the book of Daniel, like Revelation, is a book of apocalypse. The word apocalypso, or apocalypse, means the unveiling of a truth that has been concealed by God. And as we go through, we're going to see some things that God's going to reveal to Daniel. They were concealed before. Nobody saw them until God revealed them. They were hidden. Their eyes were closed to that fact. So Daniel begins his story with a narrative of his earliest experiences of being captured by Nebuchadnezzar in 605, 604 BC. But he continues there in his public service until 537. But he continues in his prophetic ministry until 535, and his writings seem to end somewhere between 532 and 530. So Daniel, again, focuses on the sovereignty of God, and Daniel writes when Israel had every right to believe that God's promises were broken. The northern kingdom's gone. The southern kingdom's gone. They're in two different places. They're living in captivity. What about all these promises to Israel? What's going to happen to Israel in the future? It looked like all God's promises has been broken. But Daniel says that's not the case. Because here's what Daniel shows. He says that arising from the ashes, the clarion call of all the affairs on earth and all the outcomes on earth, including the deliberations and the defeat of kings, rest in God's hands. In this whole book, this is what Daniel's singing. He's got the whole world in his hands. It may be very, very simple, childlike song, but you know what? There's some powerful truth there. And we're going to see when we're done with this book, that's what Daniel's saying. You got a problem? He's got the whole world in his hands. And your problem's in the middle of the world. There is absolutely nothing he can't take care of. And we're going to go through Daniel, and we're going to see that God takes care of every single thing that needs to be taken care of. Why? Because he does have the whole world in his hand. This book is a scholarly work, as Daniel's one of the most educated men in the Bible. Like Moses and Solomon from the Old Testament and Paul from the New Testament, Daniel was an intellectual. Daniel 1 through 21. Lessons learned from captivity is this message here. There are 4 truths that I want us to learn today. Actually, there'll be more than 4, but these are the 4 main ones. First, God can accomplish his plan through non-believers. Now, God would like to accomplish his plan through believers. And he does when we're walking with him and we're talking with him. And when we're living the way we're supposed to live, God uses us. However, if we rebel or if we fall into idolatry, we start living life the way we want to live life instead of living life the way God wants us, God says, that's not a problem. I can get lost people to do what I want them to do. Nebuchadnezzar did not take over Jerusalem. The Bible says that God gave it into his hands. So God can use even non-believers. Second, God prepares his servants. I love this. Notice that Nebuchadnezzar was going to train them for 3 years. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was teaching them something. He thought he's preparing them. And God's like, no. I'm preparing my servants to stand strong. They're going to be faithful to me. So he uses these 3 years to prepare them. God prepares you and God prepares me. I remember that when Debbie and I, we sold our business, we left First Woodstock and got to Graceville, Florida, and Debbie was actually with a toothbrush on her knees cleaning the baseboards in the little apartment on campus we got, because it wasn't exactly the cleanest little apartment in the world. And she had tears run down her face because we left a nice home and a great church and all that, and we find ourselves there, and I mean, life was just different until she heard a song from New Song. Eddie Carswell, a dear friend of ours, that is New Song. And that song was saying, he's already there. He's prepared you for, God's prepared you for what he's got for you. And by the way, he's already there. You realize God was in Babylon before Daniel and Hananiah? God was already there. So God prepares his servants. The third thing we're going to learn is that in love, God's servants stand strong. We have no reason, no cause to be arrogant. Am I thankful that I'm a Christian? Absolutely, because I know where my eternal destiny is. But it doesn't give me the right to be arrogant about it or boastful about it. Should I be glad? Absolutely. You should be proud of your Christianity and stand firm, but we do it in love. I love the fact that Daniel didn't command the chief officer and say, I'm a believer, I'm a follower of Yahweh, and therefore I am not going to do this. He didn't. Notice it says he requested. So we'll find that in love, God's servants stand strong. And in fourth, God blesses his servants for standing strong. All God has to ask out of them is just be faithful, stand with me. And that's all he asks us today, is to stand strong. So God's people, whether Israel or the church, we always stand countercultural as opponents to this world. The world says, let's go this way. Full of sin and fun and all kinds of stuff out there. The world wants us to go in that direction through the media, through everything. And God says, no, this is the way. The problem with so many people today is we know where the line is. And we'll get right up on the line because we like to look over and see what sin looks like. Daniel knows where the line is. He backs as far away as he can. He says, there's the line. I don't have to worry about falling over. Why? Because I'm staying away from it. The world wants you and I to follow in the teachings of the world, which are countercultural to the teachings of God. That's where Daniel, and we'll see that more than any other book, you'll see that Daniel and his friends are living countercultural to what that would be in the Babylonian Empire. You think there's sin in America today? Go back to the Babylonian Empire. It was full of sin and idolatry. So that's particularly true here in this because of the dominance of Babylon. So the first point, God accomplishes his plan through non-believers. Look at verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of God. Now Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem because Pharaoh of Egypt invaded Babylon. And in response to that, he chased Nebuchadnezzar, that young prince, chased the Egyptian king all the way down to the Sinai. And on the way back from the Sinai, he's like, hey, I can take over this land too. So he decides he's going to capture Jerusalem. Now Nebuchadnezzar, at least at the beginning of the book of Daniel, his tune changed by the time the book's over, but at the beginning of the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar thought he had defeated God. He thought he had defeated the king. He thought he had won Jerusalem. That's the way it looked. But the Bible makes it clear that God gave it to him. Why? Because God is going to make sure that his will gets done. And so on the way back, he took it over. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand somewhere around 597, along with Ezekiel and some of the others. Now, this deportation is talked about in 2 Kings 24, 14 through 16. But it was prophesied earlier by Isaiah in 39:7. This is what he says. And they shall take away your sons, who shall descend from you, from who you beget, and they shall become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now, when we think about eunuchs, the word that is used for eunuchs there in Hebrew, it can refer to those who usually, if a man is working with the queens or with women in the kingdom, they become a eunuch, a physical eunuch. That is not the full intent of the word here. Anybody that works in the king's service, that works closely with the kings, his cupbearer, they were called eunuchs. So it doesn't mean that Daniel and his friends were actually made physical eunuchs. Could have been, but we don't know that because that word's much bigger than just what we think of it being for. But this prophecy leads Daniel and his companions, spiritual eunuchs at least, and servants working for the king. The Lord gave Judah into the hands of Babylon. I love this. This is no more a victory for Nebuchadnezzar than Jesus hanging on a cross and dying on a cross was a victory for the devil. Now, the devil thought he had victory. You know, I've killed him. I've killed the Son of God. He is dead. And 3 years later, he found out, no, that wasn't the case. Nebuchadnezzar's going to find out. In fact, by the end of it, instead of him robbing God of God's vessels in his house, he's actually going to make the statement, anybody at all in my kingdom that even says anything negative against the God of Daniel, I'll take their head. He's serious about it. His view has changed. I'm not saying he's a believer, but his view on who God is and God's power changed. So this was not a victory. He thought it was, but it wasn't a victory as he thought it was. I like this. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim. This is the first time that he intervened. And by the way, we're going to find 3 times God intervenes. Jehoiakim's got life good. He's got a great army. By the way, he was friends with the king of Egypt, with Pharaoh. Okay? Which that's a mistake. That may be one of the reasons that Nebuchadnezzar wanted. I mean, he chased them all the way down to the Sinai and coming back. Well, why not wipe these guys out too? Because, I mean, after all, these are friends with Pharaoh. They had a partnership together. And, but I love the fact that the Lord delivered Jehoiakim into his hand. There was an old preacher called R.G. Lee. Some of you may remember R.G. Lee. He had a message called Payday Someday. They say he preached it over 1,000 times. Powerful message. Thousands of people would get saved when they would hear his message. And because it was talking about Ahab and Jezebel. You remember Ahab and Jezebel? And Israel was saying, what's going on here? I mean, these are the most wicked king and the wicked queen. I mean, you think about anything ungodly, and they're exceeding it. Where's God in this whole thing? And his whole thing about payday someday was payday's coming someday. In fact, you remember the 450 prophets of Baal and Elijah is there standing against them. And Elijah says, Jezebel, the dogs will drink your blood off the streets. And we find out a few chapters later it does. It comes true. In other words, payday's coming. And what had happened is because Israel, because Judah had sinned and sinned and sinned, they hadn't kept God's promises, payday came. And both the northern and the southern kingdom now are in exile. I often wonder, when I look at the world that we're in, how long is God going to tarry with us? We've got a payday someday coming too. Now, realize this. If every one of us in this room are truly born-again Christians, and we were the only true Christians in the entire state of North Carolina, okay? And if God were to exalt his wrath on us, we would have to suffer with the rest of them. Now, we know at the very end, when the rapture takes place, we won't face those 7 years of tribulation. But God lets us go through. Why? It purifies us. It refines us. And so we find that Daniel and his friends, they're godly people. They are God-fearers. They worship God. They were doing it right, but the whole kingdom had to go in, and so they went in too. And we learned from them. But make no doubt about it, there's a payday coming someday for America. I think I shared with you before. I heard a pastor one time say that if God doesn't do something to America soon, he owes Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. And of course, I disagree with that. But I understand the sentiment. I mean, if you look at what's going on in our country today, in our state, in our city, I mean, we live in an ungodly. You realize there's a lot of people. There's a large population of people in America today saying that you're the problem. You're the problem with this world. You Christians, you cause all the problems. You're so rigid. You won't be flexible and accept everything and everybody. It's the difference in accepting people and accepting their sin. The Bible says you love the sinner, but you hate the sin. You don't condone their sin. What did Jesus say to the woman caught in adultery? Go and sin no more. You know, he accepted her the way she was, but he told her, go and stop sinning. I think about and by the way, talking about us suffering. There are so many people I know. I've shared with you about Jamal in Iraq. I think I'm going to share with you about Hussein in Malaysia. I mean, I've got so many friends I've met that suffer. I told you about Dennis Dada with the stripes on his back. I mean, these are people who are, I would call righteous suffering. Because if we go into captivity, the righteous go in with the unrighteous. So we can see that God has a plan, and God can use even lost people to complete that plan, which I think about the vessels. Think about this for a moment. The vessels that went in, Daniel mentions it twice in verse 2. He says they went into Shinar, and the vessels went into the treasury of the king. Now, they're going to come back in chapter 5. We'll see them in chapter 5 at Belshazzar's feast. We'll see them again. But how horrible is it that something that was created to worship God, to adore God, for God's service, is now being used by a pagan king? That's what's happening. In fact, it's such an atrocity. Daniel mentions it twice in verse 2. But also think about us. You and I are set apart as vessels for God's use. We don't need to be part of unrighteousness either. It's a travesty. Second thing, God prepares his servants. I love this part here. As followers of the Lord, we should always be ready to serve him and always be ready for him to prepare us. And by the way, every time God prepares you, it's not always pleasant. I remember one time, I am probably one of the most impatient people in the world. And one time I can remember we were at First Woodstock and the pastor had been preaching on patience, and I actually made the mistake of praying for patience. Well, I didn't realize that the only way God can make you really, truly patient is to test your patience, which means things are going to happen. Well, that's part of God's preparation for me and God's preparation for you. Sometimes when God prepares, now think about it for a minute. Daniel and his friends, when they were in Judah, life was great for them. And now all these things are going to happen to them. They've been captured. Now they've got to take 3 years of training under Nebuchadnezzar's tutors. All these things, they were not happy. This was not a fun place for them to be. But God used that, and he prepared them. And sometimes when God prepares us, it's not pleasant either, but it's for his good and for our good. So the second thing, he prepares his servants. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was doing it, but in reality, he wasn't. some theologians say, well, why did Nebuchadnezzar do this? And they say, well, maybe he was trying to brainwash them. Others say, no, these were the very most the intelligent people in all the kingdom. He saw their value. But when you look at all of it, the king's food, the king's wine, the king's best teachers, I mean, he's whining and dining. What is he doing? He's wanting a total wipe away, if you will, a clear wipe of everything that had to do with God and with the culture. And so what he wants to totally subdue them so that they depend on Nebuchadnezzar. And think about it. He's saying, boys, I'm going to give you some of my wine, some of my food, I'm going to give you the best education. You need something, come to me. I'm the king here. Come to me. And Daniel says, I don't think I'll defile myself. I'm going to depend on him. He's always been good enough in the past. He'll be good enough in the future. I'm going to depend on him. But notice how he does it. He does it in a very kind way. He doesn't say, listen, I follow Yahweh God, and I'm not going to do this. He makes a request. He says, would you allow me to do this? I love that fact. So Nebuchadnezzar's preparation for these 3 years, he thought he was doing it for himself, but God was actually using it for himself. Verse 7, Nebuchadnezzar's changed their names. I love this here. And by the way, you notice the guys don't get upset with their name changed. And I figured this out. Do you know why? It's because they knew who they were. Look at Daniel, for example. Daniel means God is judge. And they changed it to Belshazzar, which means Baal protects my life. The false god Baal. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If I was Daniel, I'd say, wait, God's my judge. Baal doesn't control my life. Daniel never even answers it. Why? Because he's secure. He knows God still is judge. So you can change my name if you want to, but it doesn't change my worldview on things. Hananiah means Jehovah is gracious. Changes to Shadrach, which is the Sumerian moon god. Mishael, who is like God, and you can see this is done this way intentionally. Who is like God to Meshach means who is like a coup, or salvation is through a coup, which is another god. They're doing everything they can just to wipe away the slate, if you will. And then on Azariah means the Lord helps, to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. And so here, they had to do all this training process, but what he's doing, he's teaching them, he's training them to stand strong. And that's what he's doing with you and I, is he's teaching us to stand strong. And the third thing is, in love, God's servants do stand strong. When we respond to adversity, not only through courage, but courtesy, God can melt hearts. If we respond in thank you. Don't know where I'll put it. Down there. Thank you. But let me lose my voice now. And you're recording this, of course. When we respond angrily to people, even when they do something to us, we don't win the right to share with them. But when we, out of courtesy, we stand strong in courage, but we're courageous, but we're also courteous about it. Will you not let me defile myself? I mean, I serve God, I serve Yahweh, and I'll do what you want me to do, but this would be defiled. And why? Well, you need to realize that first off, the food was not food that had been prepared for a Jew. Okay, so it's not clean, prepared food for them. Second, it had been offered to idols. That would be idolatry. And third, just eating the meal prepared by the king's chef shows an alliance and allegiance to the king. There's 3 reasons that Daniel would say, I'm not going to defile myself. I can't. Why? Because the food hadn't been prepared properly for me. Second, it's been offered as a sacrifice to idols. Because that's what they do. They offer the very best as a sacrifice. They take the king leftover, and the king gives a good portion to those that he was trying to sway in his favor. But here he says, I love the fact where he says he purposed in his heart. And that's what I want to share with us today is, that's what I think we need to do. We need to purpose in our hearts that no matter what this world throws at us, we will not defile ourselves. There's something God says this is right and we should always do it. There's something God says this is wrong and we should always never do it, and we shouldn't. Well, for example, I can't tell you how many friends, even in seminary, I would see friends and they'd go out and get caught up with a crowd of people they like, good people, okay, but they start telling those off-color jokes. And rather than saying, you know, I really don't need to be a part of that, and kindly stepping away, they stay and listen to it. And then sometimes they pick it up and they start telling it. Or they go somewhere and their conviction is, we shouldn't be drinking. And I know, but these friends are mine, and if I don't, I'll just get one glass of wine and kind of sip on it all night long. Compromising. And so Daniel says, I won't do it. I will not compromise. If God says it's right, I'll do it. But he does it in kindness. And that's what we need. We don't need to be arrogant and say, well, bless God, I'm the preacher at Shoreline. I'm not going to drink. No, just say, my conviction is I shouldn't drink. So, if you want to drink and you don't have a conviction that it's wrong, that's between you and God. But don't ask me to compromise my conviction, and I won't ask you to compromise yours. And that's what Daniel's saying here. Daniel's very kind about this, but he's very firm. I can't defile myself because of him. Verse 8, notice Daniel's demeanor. Really, he's kind. I just can't do it. He purposed in his heart. And that's what I would say I would hope for all of us today. We purpose in our hearts. Exodus 34:15 shows it clearly forbids any food that hasn't been made proper for the Jewish society. He said, I will not defile myself. He only wanted to eat kosher food. That's what he was supposed to have. That's what was promised to him. Verses 9 and 10, I love this. Not only did the Lord intervene when he delivered him out of the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, but notice what it says here. God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. Because Daniel did it God's way, again, God intervenes, and he shows them God intervenes in his life. Because the official could have said, no, not going to happen. You're going to eat this food, you're going to drink this wine, it's going to happen. But he found favor. That's the second time. We're going to see a third time that he intervenes also. In Daniel verse 11 through 14, Daniel works through the issue with the commander of the officials. He stands strong, but he does it with kindness, which is a lesson for us today. The fourth thing is that God blesses his servants for standing strong. Look at verse 15 through 21. Daniel and his companions are blessed and they're promoted. Notice what it says here. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and all wisdom. And Daniel even had understanding in visions and dreams. Now, at the end of those days, when the king had said that they should be brought back to the eunuchs, brought to them before Nebuchadnezzar, then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king, and in all the matters of wisdom and understanding which the king examined them, he found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in the land. Daniel continued until the next king. And so I find that really interesting. Is 3 times God has intervened. I wonder in our lives how many times God's intervened. I mean, God intervenes in our life, I would say daily. We may not see it, but God intervenes in our life, and he does it for us. He does it to complete his will, but it's for our good that he does these things. And so as we're looking through the book of Daniel, I find 3 times here, just in chapter 1, where God intervenes. He gives them a way into captivity. He gives them favor for these 4 with the chief and magistrate. And then also here, he comes back and he gives them wisdom. And he gives them knowledge so that even Nebuchadnezzar going, man, out of everybody in my kingdom, nobody. Out of all the Chaldeans, nobody is as smart as, these are 10 times better than all the guys I've got. Of course I'm going to listen to them. Don't you find it interesting? And by the end of the book, we're going to find out God changes Nebuchadnezzar's heart because of these 4 guys. He doesn't become a believer, but he does realize there's something different going on here. And it's because of Daniel had purposed in his heart. The 4 guys purposed in their heart. I find it interesting that even today, when things happen, I remember when Billy Graham was alive. How many presidents do you think called for Billy Graham in times of trouble? Dr. Graham, would you come to the White House? The president wants to see you. I mean, he was, for many presidents, he was their spiritual advisor. The presidents realize, whether they want to accept it or not, there is a God. And God has control of things. It might be helpful if I'm going to make some strategic move if I have somebody that knows God here beside me. Billy Graham was at the White House quite often, just like Daniel. Why? Because of wisdom. I wonder if we lived our lives the way that Daniel lived his life, if God would do more in us and through us. I'm convinced the reason that God used Billy Graham so much, and I know Daniel says there's no heroes, and I agree with him except for God. But Billy Graham's simple message and his faithfulness to proclaim that message and to keep himself clean and not defile himself all the days of his life, I believe that's why God used him the way he did. Why is he a global icon for Christianity? Because he did it well. And I'm convinced as we get through this book, we're going to see that God stays with these 4 boys, And remember, they were young. They were teenagers when this took place. And God uses them. So, I mean, here we are 2,500 years later talking about this, 3,500 years later talking about this, and we're still calling out their names. God is still using them. They've been dead and in heaven for a lot of years, and God is still using them. I wonder for us if we will purpose in our heart, and we'll stand and say, I'll not defile myself. Not for that, not for that. I'm not going to defile myself, no matter what. Whether I become popular or not popular, doesn't matter. I'm not going to defile myself. We need to stand firm and stand in humility. So today, here's what I would say. Of all the things we've learned, I think we need to purpose in our heart. Today, every one of us. It's the beginning of a new year. Let's purpose in our heart not to defile ourselves in any shape, form, or fashion because of who He is.